the Trocadero in Shaftesbury Avenue. In the 1930s, it was one of London's most popular night spots. All the top variety acts of the day were seen here. But while the show was going on, unknown to most of the audience, a different kind of entertainment was taking place in the bar upstairs. For the Trocadero was also one of the favourite meeting places for London's homosexual community.
It was like cafe society. People would dodge from table to table and they'd say, oh, do come and meet my friend over here. And I've got so-and-so with me. He's up from Bristol or something like that. You could be sure of getting off in the Trocadero bar with some very nice, fairly well-to-do person.
The subculture of which the Trocadero was a part was unknown to most Londoners. And until recently, it lingered only in the memories of a dwindling band of older gays. Now, however, a new generation of gay men are hurrying to learn what they can about the 30s before these memories are gone forever. For although the modern gay world is very different, they believe it was at that period and in that tiny social world that modern concepts of homosexuality first emerged. In this programme, we'll be finding out why, and we'll be looking at the good and the bad aspects of that legacy left to gay men.
Gifford Skinner grew up in the early part of the century. He was aware from a very early age that he was far more attracted to other boys than to girls, and that this made him different.
I can remember in the infant school, we used to do an awful lot of marching in those days, the school teacher playing a march on the piano. And I always used to look at the boy in front, his bottom, the crease going from side to side. I found it was absolutely fascinating. And as quite an infant, I was very, very interested in my own sex.
But the world Gifford was growing up in thought very differently about men like him. People knew, of course, that men could and did have sex with one another. But they thought of this as a sin that any man could commit. The idea of separating out a particular group who were more than usually attracted to their own sex and giving them the label homosexual had not yet occurred to most people. So men like Gifford found it difficult to know what to call themselves.
No. First of all, the word was musical. They'd say, well, that was the polite euphemism. They'd say, is he musical? If they were discussing people, you would say, is he musical? Meaning to say, is he gay? Then, of course, the word so came in, which was really supposed to be done in almost a French way. You know, is he so? Rather politely. The first time I heard the expression so was when I started work. I'd never heard the expression before, and I wasn't aware such people existed. Now, this is Bear Street. Here we are. This is the very Bear Street.
No, this is JB's, isn't it?
The next one, yes.
Oh, yes.
Because they felt different, men like Gifford grouped together to form a small exclusive clique. Their way of life has given rise to many of the beliefs we hold today about gays. So we asked Gifford and his friend Benny to guide us round their world.
I know he did.
I don't know whether these are
The men who drank in the upstairs bar at JB's called each other sisters. That was because, since they had no other way of thinking of themselves, they assumed there must be some kind of intermediate sex, more like women.
This reminds you of old times, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And we used to sit here, because I always used to occupy the seat up in the corner there, in the window. And you remember Rosie Bothways used to come here?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
She was a scream. Rosie Bothways used to say, well, of course, I only work in service and for my particular boss because his clothes fit me. And, of course, she did appear in them. Magnificent overcoats with velvet collars.
Yes.
And things like, always a red buttonhole, you know. At one time, she was known as Russian Rose because very dark features, yes.
Do you remember Lady Lavender?
My dear, yes.
With the two white borzoi
Yes,
dogs?
yes. But do you know why she was called Lady Lavender? She came from Mitcham.
What's
the... Mitcham Lavender.
Oh, I see.
Yes. Well, I mean, people all had camp names, didn't they?
Well, yeah.
Yes, I was always known as May.
Were you? I didn't have a camp name.
Didn't you?
No.
Well, you probably didn't know about it. Everybody was Ethel and Kate and
yes.
all that sort of thing.
Many of these men were in jobs in domestic service, for they were keen to be in the West End, near what we'd now call the gay scene. and so they would take these low-paid jobs which heterosexual men would not have accepted so readily. Their evenings off would follow a regular pattern, often beginning with tea at places like Lyon's Corner House, dubbed the Lily Pond because of its popularity with camp men. The management tried to turn them away, unsuccessfully.
This was the corner house, Lyon's Corner House, and of course you know that, don't you? Because you used to go to the Lily Pond the same as I did upstairs.
The first floor, wasn't
it lovely? Yes.
They had two entrances, didn't
Yes,
they?
yes.
And they used to go up one entrance, and the floor manager didn't like the look of them, he barred them.
Yes.
He used to come outside, walk round to the other one, go up there, and they used to say, come in here, and the nippers used to, with the waitresses, remember the nippers?
The nippers, they were charming.
Yes,
they always liked the gays, didn't they?
They always did, yes. And they actually put you in a corner seat where the floor manager couldn't see you.
Once the pubs opened, Gifford and his friends would go on from Lyons to one of 3 or 4 favourite haunts.
Now, do you remember the...
Oh, that's the site of the lovely Cavour, my
Cavour
darling
bar.
Cavour bar, yes.
Remember walking down those
Yes,
stairs?
yes. Oh, didn't we have some wonderful time?
But Gifford and his friends didn't find sexual partners in bars like these. That's because sleeping with your friends was like sleeping with other women. They wanted real men, and those had to be found elsewhere.
Real men were more attractive because one wasn't attracted to one's contemporary sisters, gay people. I was once asked by one of my bits of trade. He said, "Well, why do you like going with me? Why don't you go with one of your friends? They're so elegant and attractive." Such as Jim, he would say, what's her name? And I'd say, "Oh my God, I wouldn't go to bed with her." But he could never understand it. They always thought it was rather strange that one should run the risk of taking a stranger back to one's home and instead of taking one of one's friends and doing the same thing. It was absolutely impossible, though. I couldn't consider such a thing. I really liked the real thing or nothing.
Despite the fact that all homosexual acts were against the law, it was surprisingly easy to find men who were prepared to have sex. They were mostly working class, and soldiers were especially obliging.
Guardsmen were available in a pub called the Pakenham, but you could walk in Hyde Park on any afternoon, and they would be really, I suppose, they were looking for nursemaids, taking babies out just to have a little flirtation, but it never got them very far. But they had to wear their red tunics when they were out. No civilian clothes were worn, allowed. And they looked very, very smart indeed. They were magnificent, really. You could tell them a mile off. And the colour was gorgeous against the green in Hyde Park. And it was very easy to chat to them. The usual way was to ask for a light, or the time, or something like that, and then you'd chat away. And he'd know what you were after. And the price was 2 shillings upwards. It was quite easy to get them. They were more than willing because that was the only bit of sexual pleasure it was possible for them to have. A lot of them, of course, had a connection of rather well-to-do people, and all this was discovered once when an address book was found. If they were sent abroad, they'd sell their address book to their mate, and he'd take over where they left off. And the old queens would give a tip to the one that sold the book, because he would say, "Well, you won't go without. I'll put a very nice mate of mine on to you. Oh, thank you very much. Well, here's a little present for doing that. Thank you." And of course, he'd get tips from both sides before he went abroad.
The main reason why so many real men, even servicemen, were available was because most people then were unaware of the concept homosexual. It was possible for men to have homosexual experiences without feeling that it made them queer. This, plus the attraction of a little pocket money, meant that many men felt able to go to bed with people like Gifford without it affecting the way they thought of themselves.
Because you could often get 2 back at a time. Often they wouldn't separate. Yeah, especially sailors. They said, "I want my oppo with me." And he'd even sleep in a chair all night. That's been done before now. And you chose which one you wanted, and you stuck with him, and you didn't have the oppo. He sat in the chair. The rough people were quite conscious of the fact that they weren't gay and that they were only doing it to Bob.
This brings back memories, Gifford.
Does it? Why?
Yes. Well, do you remember?
That's the Alhambra.
This is the Odeon now.
Yes.
But that was the Alhambra.
Yes. It was
And-
very much more ornate in those days,
Oh, it's
wasn't it? Yes,
beautiful
it was all
oriental
black
outside.
now, yes.
And I played in that theatre.
No.
Theatres like the Alhambra are fondly remembered by people like Gifford and Benny. For, since the public had no real idea that homosexual encounters took place, they could go on uninterrupted in the galleries while the audience were applauding the show.
Did you ever go in the theatre?
Oh, very many times, but it was for cruising, dear. It was very, very successful indeed. You couldn't go wrong.
Outside on the streets too, encounters went on more or less uninterrupted. Even the police weren't a real problem.
Police could be intimidated, actually, if you got into trouble with them. It was largely done by the way one spoke. I soon learnt that one should address them as constable with a U rather than constable, which was a little bit common, you see. And they knew the difference. If you said constable, they'd, oh my God, I've got hold of somebody here. And they'd, well, I just wanted to tell you so. It's rather dangerous to linger here. So if I were you, I'd go home. You've had a drop too much, haven't you? Or something like that. Very, very fatherly and very charming.
Oh, the pavilion, where they had all those lovely
Cochran
shows.
reviewed.
So, although homosexuality was regarded as a sin and was severely punished by law, and although for many homosexually inclined men, the 30s must have been a time of ignorance, guilt and fear. For the few men who moved in the world of West End theatres, cafes and pubs, it seems in retrospect to have been a golden age.
Oh, and of course the times I've been down here, you know the roundabout round here. We didn't have any feelings of persecution at all, really. Not so much as we do today. We had the freedom of the West End, really, in certain hours. That would be from 7 o'clock, and the streets would be ours.
But even as Gifford and Benny sipped their mixed vermouth in the Trocadero, the days of their free and easy little world were numbered. Society was about to discover the homosexual. That discovery brought their exotic lifestyle to an end, but the image they created is still influencing our view of homosexuality long after they have gone. In part 2, we see how. Richard Krafft-Ebing, Havelock Ellis, and Sigmund Freud were the leaders of a new breed of scientists called sexologists, who devoted themselves to the study of human sexual behavior. It was these men who began the process of discovering the homosexual. They had begun their work in the late 19th century, before the men who made up the gay scene of the 30s were even born. But their writings were to remain confined to intellectual circles for many years. At the time they wrote, science was just beginning to view human behavior in a wholly new way, dividing people into different types, normal and abnormal, each with their own distinct personalities and even physical characteristics. The sexologists did the same for sex, and so people who preferred their own sex became homosexuals.
Before the 19th century, homosexual activities, homosexual practices existed, but the notion that there was such a person as the homosexual didn't exist. This is a relatively recent notion and is no older than about 100 years. What was punished was certain forms of homosexual activities, usually sodomy, in fact. But sodomy was a characteristic of, in a sense, of all sinful people. It wasn't a characteristic of a particular type of person. Whereas increasingly, from the end of the 19th century, homosexuality is seen as the characteristic of a particular species, the species of the homosexual. What matters to the sexologists in the late 19th century, and in this century, in fact, is an attempt to define what's normal and what's abnormal. Now, this notion of normality is very much related to the much sharper definitions of masculinity and femininity in the course of the 19th century, and the bond that brings masculinity and femininity together, heterosexuality. And the homosexual, the description of the homosexual, is an attempt to fit a certain group of people into this notion that there are sharp divisions between male and female. And the only way you can do that in terms of social science is to say that certain people are somehow intermediate between real men and real women.
It was from the precursors of men like Gifford and his friends that the sexologists got most of their ideas about homosexuals. When they saw that effeminate sisters had sex with masculine trade, they concluded there must be two sorts of homosexual, and they called them inverts and perverts.
Essentially, the notion of inversion was invented by the sexologists at the end of the 19th century to describe those people they saw as inherently homosexual, people whose homosexuality was inborn, congenital. The notion of perversion was an attempt to explain, a feeble attempt to explain, those people who they saw not as inborn homosexuals, but those who were corrupted into homosexuality, either through inadequate parents or through corruption in youth or through bad influences in adulthood. So you get this sort of dichotomous version developing of the real homosexual who has to be pitied and the person who is potentially corruptible into it, who has to be protected.
The next day, their Majesties paid a visit of inspection to the South Bank exhibition.
Post-war Britain may not have seemed the kind of world to be obsessed with homosexuals. Yet it was at this time that the sexologists' ideas were first to take hold of the public consciousness.
About 2 hours was made. The exhibition is the central point of the festival, and in the space of some 27 acres, there's plenty of evidence of British...
It was a world obsessed with patriotism and with building a new future. It was a world that celebrated the family and the values of ordinary suburban life. Yet it was in this setting that the sexologists' concept of the homosexual, or the invert, was to become known to the broad public for the first time. And this discovery led the public to become obsessed with the idea of the effeminate homosexual corrupting those around him. It all began in 1951, the year Burgess and Maclean fled the country on the eve of their arrest as spies. Much was made of the fact that Burgess, seen here in Moscow with the late Tom Dryburgh, was a known homosexual. In many people's minds, the words homosexual and traitor became synonymous. That same year, the Metropolitan Police announced a Clean Up the West End campaign aimed directly against prostitutes and homosexuals. Police arrests for indecency multiplied tenfold compared with the 1930s. In 1954, Lord Montagu and journalist Peter Wildeblood are accused of seducing two young airmen. Now gays are corrupters of public morals. The boys are in the forces and also underage. 1957, Ian Harvey, junior minister at the Foreign Office, arrested for indecency with a guardsman.
I'd been to a party at one of the embassies, and I'd been to the house to vote. And then on my way home, I thought, well, I might take a little exercise. And I went into the park, and I met a young guardsman, and he went with me, and we went into the darkness of the trees. And unfortunately, we were discovered by the police and one of the park keepers, and I was then arrested. Serious papers thought how very terrible it all was that a junior minister of the Foreign Office should be involved in this way. The popular press, of course, made the most of it, as they would. My political contemporaries obviously had to remember that if they were thought to be friends of a homosexual, people would assume immediately that they too were homosexuals. And so, quite naturally, they steered away. But mind you, once this had happened, I tendered my resignation, and I didn't go back to the house ever again.
Popular papers began offering advice on how to identify one of these dangerous effeminates who were supposedly busy corrupting the state. "Anybody with a grain of sense can smell these homos," the Sunday Mirror wrote. For homosexuals like John Alcock, who were in London during those years, it was a terrifying time.
They thought that homosexuals were great corrupters because of the amount of publicity that was going on at that particular time with the two cases that I've mentioned, and also, of course, Burgess and Maclean and the spy syndrome and things like that. And they thought that, and one or two film stars who at that particular time had fallen from grace. And so everybody assumed that all homosexuals were alike, that they were corruptors and inclined to do harm to people, and that we had two heads and what have you. In that period, I even remember that I came home and burnt all my love letters because I was scared shitless. I really was very, very frightened. And this was very, very general. There was a sort of a witch hunt that was going on. Names were brandished all over the place and what have you. People became very frightened during that period.
It's hard to know exactly why society became so hostile to gay men in the 1950s. It's likely that the notion of the homosexual had already begun to filter into popular consciousness even before the Second World War, as the gay scene had expanded and become more visible in the 1930s. Then the war itself, by providing more opportunities for men to have sex with each other, would undoubtedly have spread knowledge of homosexuality even further. And then finally, perhaps, after the war had ended, the need to reassert normality was bound to have meant that exceptions to conventional behavior would be less easily tolerated. But whether this is the correct explanation or not, the fact that the public had seized on the notion of the homosexual man as an invert who went around perverting other so-called normal men was bound to have important effects on the way that gays were to see themselves from then on. And it is from these effects that they are only now emerging. Dudley Cave was one of the generation of gay men who were under attack in the 1950s. They soon found a defence, the sexologists' ideas themselves. Dudley had first come into contact with these notions when he'd been given a book to read by an army doctor.
I said, "I'm homosexual." I'd only read the word, I'd never heard it. And she said, "Well, just because you masturbate, it doesn't mean that." And I said, "Oh, no," with agony, I'm certain. And he stopped me and said, "Look, I'm not an expert in this, but we have an expert in the camp, a sexologist, Dr. Philip Bloom, and I'll arrange for you to see him if you like." Well, I saw Philip Bloom. He discussed things with me, my attitudes, my feelings, made it quite clear to me that I was homosexual, lent me his copy of Havelock Ellis's Sexual Inversion in Men, and I read that and I recognized myself absolutely clearly on those pages.
What Dudley responded to in Ellis's book was not the notion of the homosexual as pervert, but as invert, a distinct type of person born different from everyone else.
Well, it's years since I've read it, but there were certain things like we were supposed to be attracted to blue, oh well, never mind, and green. We had the pubic hair tended to be triangular, straight at the top, and not up to the navel, as is apparently more heterosexual. In my experience, that does seem to be fairly true, and that bodily distribution of fat was more in the feminine way than the male way.
Ellis was therefore thinking of homosexuals as a different type of person, biologically different. Did you share that view?
I don't know whether I did or not, but I was prepared to accept what did seem to be like evidence. Certainly my pubic hair ended on a flat line at the top, and I seemed to fit, and I also, blue had been my favourite colour, and I did seem to fit in with that. So I was prepared to accept it. And I saw no reason why I shouldn't. It didn't come into conflict with any views I had particularly.
Many men of that generation sincerely believed that not only they, but all homosexuals were born that way.
Homosexuals are born homosexual. There's no doubt about that in my mind whatsoever. children do go through a phase during puberty of which they pass through, and they'll find pleasant or unpleasant and accept or discard as they feel fit. But no, a homosexual is born and he or she can do nothing about it whatsoever. And indeed, why should they want to do anything about it? When you sort of thought it through, you know, it's quite great to be gay. And you'd never have a problem. No, no, no. You wake up, you go to bed at night gay, and you'll wake up in the morning gay, and that's all there is to it.
A crop of books were published in the early 60s, all arguing the same thing, for it seemed the perfect defence against the public's hostility. If homosexuals were a species apart, born and not made, then they could not possibly corrupt other men to their ways.
Homosexuality is not a spreading infectious disease like measles or chickenpox. It is a condition. It isn't like accepting moral rearmament or joining a political party or becoming a Freemason. A man doesn't say, "This movement attracts me, I think I'll join." To the true homosexual, sexual relations with the opposite sex are unthinkable, just as the complete heterosexual will have no homosexual urge.
John Alcock was amongst many who campaigned for law reform on the grounds that it was illogical to punish a man for something he could not help being.
We wanted to be recognised and to be taken out of the business of the criminal law. I mean, it's dreadful to think that you've been branded a criminal all of your life through no particular fault of your own. Indeed, if it's a fault at all, which it is not, it was unfair, and people felt very strongly. And I would like to point out that the majority of people who felt very strongly about the Homosexual Law Reform Society at that particular time were in the main heterosexual people. They were not homosexual people. As a matter of fact, the chairman of the, or I think he was the president of the Homosexual Law Reform Society, was the Chief Constable of London Police. And then we had J.B. Priestley and the Archbishop of Canterbury of that particular time, and adding for them quite a very, very impressive list of people who were determined to get this law changed.
Eventually, their view prevailed. Lord Wolfenden had been given the job of investigating homosexuality in the law in the wake of the Montague scandal. The evidence his committee received convinced him of the need for legal change.
The chief change we're recommending there is that homosexual behaviour between adult, consenting males in private should no longer be a criminal offence. It always has been until now, or at any rate it has for about 100 years, and the sense in that we don't see. That again goes back to my general principle that there are some areas of a man's private life which are not the concern of the criminal law, except insofar as they damage public order or result in exploitation.
The 1967 Sexual Offences Act translated Wolfenden's recommendations into law. Though the bar on sex with men in the forces, or under 21, suggested that the old fears about corruption weren't dead, the gays' view of themselves as born that way had won the day. These legal changes, coupled with the sexual revolution of the late 60s and early 70s, have now produced a new generation of gays whom the men of the 30s would scarcely recognise. These men no longer beg for tolerance. They demand equal rights. Gone are the words queer and pansy. The new slogan is glad to be gay. Gone, too, is the belief that they're an effeminate halfway sex. For these men, the fact that they are gay doesn't necessarily stop them being masculine. But in one crucial respect, gay men today are still influenced by the theories developed way back at the turn of the century. Perhaps because they've had to cling so hard to the idea that they're different, to win tolerance and reform, most gay men still seem to believe that their homosexuality defines them and sets them apart from the rest of the world. Coming out, which is central to the gay movement, means more than just telling people what you do in bed. It's a revelation of your real self. Dudley Cave now works on Gay Switchboard. He came out by accident when a meeting on homosexuality which he was addressing got advertised in the local paper.
And I was out everywhere. I mean, my colleagues read this, and they all seemed to be perfectly happy about it. And they probably realized I was gay all the way along, but it kept the pretense. Of course, from then on, I didn't have to lie anymore. I could be totally open. I didn't have to pretend that there might be a girlfriend or whatever. And it's quite extraordinary, the difference that it makes, throwing away that load of lie and worry that I'd carted round for 50 years, I suppose.
I think it's been a major achievement, actually, to assert the positive nature of the gay identity. It's made it possible for large numbers of people to come out, to be open about their homosexuality, and to begin to lead stigma-free and relatively relaxed lives. It's a crucial development. But what it, in itself, what it does is to confirm the existence of a fixed minority of people within a wider society, within a normal society. It still plays about with the notion that there are some people who are normal, the majority, and some people who somehow have to be fitted into the gaps in this normality.
Now Jeff Weeks and others believe that this generation of gay men has one more big change to make, a change that will take the movement back in some ways to the world of 50 years ago. For they're questioning the whole notion that the sexologists first invented and that still brings people together on marches like this one. The notion that you can group together people who prefer their own sex and label them as a breed apart, a breed called homosexuals. Gaylib itself has already exposed the flaws in this way of thinking, they say. The movement brought out middle-aged men who'd been married and had children. Were they straight or were they gay? Did it make sense to divide the two?
We've all become obsessed with sharp definitions of what people are. We begin to define people around their sexual activity. We begin to define people as normal or abnormal around their sexual activity. I think lots of people are finding that these rigid definitions don't actually correspond to the range of desires, of wishes, of needs that they actually have.
The movement also brought out such a range of men with such varied personalities, backgrounds and interests that many argue it makes no more sense to group them together by their sexual preferences than by their height or by the colour of their eyes. And so they would argue that we should return to thinking the way that people used to do, of homosexual acts rather than of homosexual people.
So what's increasingly coming out of the gay movement, I think, is the notion that, yes, it's important to assert the gay identity as a positive act, but what we have to do as well is affirm the importance of homosexuality as a set of sexual practices. Something, in other words, that's potential in people who don't necessarily define themselves as gay. What I'm suggesting is that we're moving to a situation where there's a much wider spectrum of choice, where there's a sort of pluralism of possibilities of choice, where it'll be possible to live out a set of experiences without having to fit into these rigid definitions as they've existed for 100 years.
I'm Mexican Minnie, I waggle my pinny at all the bad men in the West. Oh, I've been quite the craze since me cow-punching days, when I once punched a very fat cow in the chest. I'm willful and wary, and once with Aunt Mary, I went on the prairie to play. But a bad man who tracked us shot me in the cactus and blew my sombrero away.